For 60 years, we've been told that one man, Lee Harvey Oswald, acted alone. But what if that story was crafted to hide something far bigger? In this video, we uncover the missing links, the silenced witnesses, and the shocking truth buried deep within the JFK assassination files. The problem we're resolving today: why the truth about JFK's death was never meant to be revealed. November 22, 1963, Dallas, Texas, the day America's dream died in broad daylight. A president loved by millions was gunned down, and the world was left searching for answers. But behind the chaos, there was a deeper story, one that powerful people tried to bury forever. Today, we dig beneath decades of lies and uncover the hidden truth behind JFK's assassination, finally revealed. They told us it was simple: a lone gunman. A single, deranged man named Lee Harvey Oswald, perched high above Dealey Plaza in the Texas School Book Depository. He fired 3 shots. 1 missed, 2 hit. And in a matter of seconds, the President of the United States was dead. The official narrative was sealed almost overnight. The Warren Commission declared it open and shut. America was given closure, or so they thought. But here's where the story begins to unravel. You see, the official version of JFK's assassination reads like a screenplay written for public comfort, not truth. Within hours of the shooting, authorities had already named Oswald as the killer before a proper investigation. Before witnesses were questioned, before ballistic evidence was fully examined. How could they be so sure, so fast? There were dozens of eyewitnesses that day in Dealey Plaza, and many of them reported hearing gunfire from more than one direction. Some claimed shots came from the infamous grassy knoll, a small hill overlooking the motorcade route. Others swore they saw a puff of smoke or flashes of light from that same area. Yet somehow, these testimonies were largely ignored or discredited by the official inquiry. The Warren Commission, established just a week after the assassination, promised to find the truth. But what they delivered was a carefully controlled narrative. Key evidence was withheld. Photographs and films were edited. Even medical records from the autopsy were inconsistent or missing. One FBI agent later admitted that the agency destroyed notes related to the autopsy. Why? Because, as he said, they were too sensitive. And then there's the so-called magic bullet. The commission claimed a single bullet struck President Kennedy in the back, exited through his throat, then hit Governor Connally in the back, shattered his wrist and lodged in his thigh, all while remaining nearly pristine when recovered on a stretcher. Experts around the world questioned the physics, the angles, the sheer impossibility of it. Yet this bullet became the foundation of the lone gunman theory. Without it, the entire story collapses. So let's ask the question, if the official story was true, why did the U.S. government seal thousands of related documents for over half a century? Why were witnesses intimidated, silenced, or mysteriously found dead? Why did the CIA and FBI both admit decades later that they withheld information from the Warren Commission itself? Even Lyndon B. Johnson, JFK's own successor, once told a journalist he doubted the official conclusion. Members of Kennedy's family, including Robert F. Kennedy, never fully believed it either. And as time passed, new evidence began to surface. Testimonies that contradicted the commission, files hinting at intelligence involvement, and reports showing Oswald's mysterious connections overseas. You mean to tell me one man acting alone did all this? A journalist once asked a Dallas detective. The detective simply shook his head. I don't believe it. And neither should you. There's another layer most people overlook: the rapid pace at which the official story was pushed onto the public. Within hours, Oswald's face was plastered across every TV screen and newspaper headline. Before he could even defend himself, he was gunned down on live television by Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner with deep mob ties. That's right. The key suspect in the most shocking crime of the century was silenced before he ever stood trial. And so, America accepted what it was told because the alternative was too terrifying to imagine. That forces, far more powerful than Oswald, orchestrated the President's murder. The media played its role perfectly. News anchors repeated the same phrases, the same timeline, the same simplified version of events until it became national memory. But as time went on, cracks began to form. people started to ask questions. Why did witnesses' stories change after FBI interviews? Why were key pieces of film evidence edited or confiscated? Why did the CIA have files on Oswald months before the assassination, yet claimed they barely knew who he was? It's as if the official version of events was never designed to explain what happened, only to control how people remembered it. And that's the real tragedy of the JFK assassination. Not just the death of a president, but the death of truth itself. Because once the story was locked in, once the Warren report was printed, it became dangerous to question it. Anyone who did was labeled paranoid, a conspiracy theorist, someone who couldn't accept reality. But reality is often stranger than fiction. And when you peel back the layers, when you look closely at the inconsistencies, from the trajectory of the bullets to the missing files, from the silenced witnesses to the government's own admissions, a new picture begins to emerge. A picture that suggests the truth about JFK's assassination wasn't lost. It was buried, hidden in plain sight, waiting for those brave enough to look deeper. To understand what really happened on November 22, 1963, we have to step into the shadowy corridors of power, the world of covert operations, intelligence secrets, and silent wars fought behind closed doors. This wasn't just the age of assassins and spies. It was the height of the Cold War, a time when the CIA operated like a nation within a nation, answering to almost no one. And right in the middle of it all was President John F. Kennedy. Kennedy had inherited a world on edge. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion had humiliated the U.S., and behind that disaster stood the CIA, an agency that had gone rogue, planning invasions, coups, and assassinations without full presidential control. Kennedy was furious. He famously told his closest aides he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. That sentence alone may have signed his death warrant. Because the CIA, at that time, was not merely an intelligence-gathering organization. It was an empire of secrets, one that had grown used to acting above the law. It had toppled governments in Iran and Guatemala. It had built deep relationships with the mafia to execute covert missions. It had connections across Cuba, the Soviet Union, and even inside America's own political machinery. And Kennedy, a young president determined to bring transparency, threatened all of that. The strange thing about Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin, is how his life seems to intersect perfectly with intelligence patterns. Before the assassination, Oswald had defected to the Soviet Union. He lived there for years, married a Russian woman, then returned to the United States without punishment or interrogation, something unheard of during the Cold War. Think about that. A self-declared defector allowed back into America, carrying a Soviet wife, no charges, no restrictions. It doesn't make sense unless you realize that maybe Oswald wasn't what he seemed. Former intelligence officers later hinted that Oswald may have been part of a false defector program, an operation designed to plant agents inside the Soviet system. That theory gains traction when you look at the people he was associated with. In New Orleans, Oswald was seen distributing pro-Castro leaflets, yet those pamphlets were traced back to a former FBI agent's address. He was posing as a Marxist, yet many of his contacts were connected to anti-Castro Cuban exiles, groups trained and funded by the CIA. So who was Oswald really working for? A confused drifter, a double agent, or a pawn in a much larger intelligence operation that went horribly, or maybe deliberately, wrong? Here's where things turn darker. Declassified CIA files show that Oswald's name appeared in agency reports months before the assassination. He wasn't invisible to them, they were tracking him. They had a file, they knew his movements, and yet they claimed total ignorance after Kennedy's death. One CIA officer even admitted later that the agency destroyed parts of Oswald's file immediately after the assassination. Why destroy evidence unless it led somewhere dangerous? And then there's the role of certain key figures inside the intelligence network. Take Allen Dulles, the CIA director whom Kennedy fired after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Despite being dismissed, Dulles somehow ended up serving on the Warren Commission, the very body tasked with investigating Kennedy's death. Think about that. The man JFK removed for misconduct was now in charge of shaping the official story of his assassination. The fox was guarding the henhouse. Many former agents and researchers have suggested that rogue elements within the CIA may have collaborated with anti-Castro groups or even mafia contacts to eliminate Kennedy, their motive. To protect covert operations, maintain control, and prevent Kennedy from pulling U.S. forces out of Vietnam or exposing CIA activities in Cuba. The president had become a threat to the establishment, a leader too unpredictable for the shadow government that operated behind the scenes. As documents were slowly released over the decades, a chilling pattern began to appear. The CIA withheld information not just from the public, but from the Warren Commission itself. One internal memo revealed that certain operational files related to Oswald were locked away, restricted even to senior investigators. Another declassified note from 1967 showed that the agency instructed its media contacts to label critics of the official story as conspiracy theorists. The term born in that document became a weapon, not against lies, but against those seeking the truth. JFK's assassination may have been the most visible act of violence in modern American history, but what happened afterward? The cover-up, the manipulation, the disinformation campaigns, that's where the real power was flexed. Behind the scenes, agencies coordinated narratives, suppressed leads, and neutralized witnesses who knew too much. It wasn't just about hiding who fired the bullets. It was about protecting the network that allowed it to happen. Even years later, when congressional committees reopened the investigation in the 1970s, shocking revelations emerged. The CIA admitted to multiple assassination plots against foreign leaders, including Fidel Castro, without presidential authorization. If they could plan the death of another world leader, could they have done the same at home? The evidence doesn't scream conspiracy. It whispers it in every redacted page, every missing tape, every mysteriously dead witness. And let's not forget the strange behavior of certain officials immediately after the assassination. CIA officers in Mexico City, where Oswald had visited shortly before the event, claimed tapes of his meetings with Soviet diplomats were accidentally destroyed. Accidentally. A pattern that keeps repeating, vital evidence disappearing right when it's needed most. The deeper you go, the clearer it becomes that this was not just an act of violence, it was an operation, planned and protected by people who understood power and how to conceal it. When Kennedy said he wanted to dismantle secret societies, when he spoke of a government that operates in the shadows, many believe he wasn't just warning the public, he was warning himself. Because in the Cold War era, truth was the greatest threat of all. And for those who thrived in secrecy, Kennedy's vision of openness was unacceptable. Lee Harvey Oswald, the name that history branded as the lone assassin, the man blamed for changing the course of America forever. But when you look closer, his life reads less like that of a solitary gunman, and more like a man being moved deliberately, strategically, across a chessboard of espionage and deception. The movements of Oswald before November 22, 1963 are so strange, so contradictory, that they force us to ask, who was he really working for? Oswald was born in New Orleans, but his story begins to twist in ways no one could have predicted. A high school dropout, a Marine, and then suddenly a defector to the Soviet Union. In 1959, at the height of the Cold War, Oswald walked into the U.S. Embassy in Moscow and announced that he was renouncing his American citizenship. He told officials he planned to give military secrets to the Soviets, secrets from his time stationed at a U-2 spy plane, base in Japan. But here's where things start to make no sense. Instead of being treated as a traitor or a national security threat, he was quietly allowed to live in the Soviet Union for 2.5 years. When he decided to come back to the United States, he wasn't punished, he wasn't interrogated, he was welcomed home. The U.S. government even helped him bring his Russian wife, Marina, back with him. Think about that. During one of the tensest periods of the Cold War, a self-declared defector returned from the enemy's capital with a Soviet spouse and was simply allowed to blend back into American life. No trial, no prison, no questions. That alone should raise alarms. After returning, Oswald began bouncing between cities, Dallas, Fort Worth, New Orleans. He worked odd jobs, lived in shabby apartments, and constantly talked about politics. One day he claimed to be a Marxist, another an anti-communist. He joined pro-Castro organizations, handed out hands-off Cuba flyers, and yet somehow some of the addresses on those flyers were traced to buildings used by anti-Castro operatives with known CIA ties. He was playing both sides, left and right, like a man following orders, not beliefs. Witnesses from that time remember Oswald as intelligent but strange, deeply political but inconsistent. He seemed rehearsed, as if performing a role. He told people he admired Castro but had friends among anti-Castro exiles. He claimed to hate America but had connections to ex-FBI agents. It's as if his life was designed to confuse anyone trying to pin him down, a walking contradiction moving between two worlds, one public and one secret. And then there was his mysterious trip to Mexico City just weeks before the assassination. Oswald visited both the Cuban and Soviet embassies, allegedly seeking travel visas, but the records of his visit are murky. The CIA claimed to have phone recordings and photographs from those embassies, yet later admitted that the voice on the tapes and the man in the photos didn't match Oswald. Was someone impersonating him? If so, who would go to such lengths to create a fake trail connecting him to communism? The Mexico City trip is a turning point because it provided the perfect cover story. If Oswald could be linked to Cuba or the Soviet Union, then his actions could be framed as a communist plot against America. It would justify retaliation, even war, and who benefits from that kind of chaos? The agencies that thrive on conflict, the industries that profit from fear. The more you examine his movements, the more they resemble a script written by professionals in psychological warfare. Even his job at the Texas School Book Depository, the building from which he allegedly fired the fatal shots, seems almost too convenient. He had been working there for only a few weeks. The route of the presidential motorcade was changed at the last minute to pass directly in front of his workplace. What are the odds that a supposed lone assassin, with no resources and no accomplices, would just happen to be stationed at the perfect vantage point for one of the most complex killings in history? And let's not forget the speed of his arrest. Within hours of the assassination, police claimed they already knew who they were looking for. Oswald was tracked down in a movie theater, arrested without a warrant, and declared guilty in the court of public opinion before any trial could begin. Reporters shouted questions, and Oswald, looking pale and dazed, said something that still echoes through history. "I'm just a patsy. A patsy, someone set up to take the blame." That statement became more haunting when 2 days later, as Oswald was being transferred under police custody, he was shot and killed on live television by Jack Ruby, a man with deep connections to organized crime nightclubs and possibly intelligence figures. Once again, the only person who could explain his actions was silenced forever. Over time, fragments of Oswald's movements began to resurface in classified files, fragments that don't line up with the lone gunman story. CIA memos mention him months before the assassination, and FBI reports suggest he had been monitored closely. Yet both agencies denied knowing anything about him until after the president was dead. Some witnesses even claimed to have seen Oswald meeting strange men in suits, speaking quietly in cafes, or receiving envelopes from unknown sources. His mother once said she believed her son was working for the government. Others described him as brainwashed, a man used and discarded by forces far beyond his understanding. Whether he was a spy, a scapegoat, or both, one thing is certain: Lee Harvey Oswald's life was no accident. His every movement, every association, every alias points toward a carefully constructed identity, one designed to lead investigators down a path that would never reach the real masterminds behind Kennedy's death. And so, the question remains, was Oswald truly the man who pulled the trigger, or was he the perfect illusion, a ghost created by the intelligence machine to hide the truth in plain sight? To truly understand why President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, we must step back into the volatile world of the early 1960s, a world hanging by a thread. Every decision was measured not in lives, but in nuclear seconds. The Cold War wasn't just a standoff between America and the Soviet Union. It was a global chess game of espionage, ideology, and unrestrained power. And in that dangerous game, JFK was the unpredictable player no one could control. After the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, Kennedy had done something unthinkable. He negotiated peace. While the world was celebrating his ability to avoid nuclear war, there were those inside Washington, inside the Pentagon, and within the intelligence community who saw that peace as weakness. They didn't want détente with Moscow or reconciliation with Cuba. They wanted dominance, not diplomacy. Kennedy's refusal to invade Cuba, to unleash full-scale war, made powerful enemies. Behind closed doors, a rift was growing between Kennedy and the establishment that thrived on tension, the military-industrial complex. Dwight D. Eisenhower had warned about it years earlier in his farewell address. The alliance between defense contractors and the government. Kennedy saw it too. He knew war was big business and that peace threatened billions in profits. Defense companies, generals, and intelligence officials all had built careers, reputations, and fortunes on fear. And JFK, a young idealist talking about disarmament and withdrawal, was bad for business. Then came Vietnam. Kennedy had begun questioning America's role there. He wanted to pull troops out, not send more in. Documents later revealed that he planned to begin a full withdrawal after the 1964 election. But to the powerful circles who wanted a full-scale war in Southeast Asia, this was betrayal. The very next president, Lyndon B. Johnson, would reverse that plan, escalating the war just months after JFK's death. Coincidence or consequence? There's also the matter of Cuba, that small island that became the obsession of Washington's power elite. After the Bay of Pigs disaster, the CIA, the military, and anti-Castro factions felt Kennedy had abandoned them. They wanted revenge on Castro, and they were willing to do whatever it took. Operation Mongoose, a secret campaign to assassinate Fidel Castro and destabilize Cuba, was already in motion. But Kennedy was pulling back, frustrated by the recklessness of these covert plans. To the mafia, the Kennedy brothers were a double threat, one political, one legal. Now imagine the web of anger surrounding JFK in those final months. To the Pentagon, he was a risk to national security. To the CIA, a man who no longer trusted their missions. To the mafia, a destroyer of their empire. To certain political factions, a president moving America toward socialism. All these forces, military, intelligence, and criminal, had overlapping interests, and all had the power to act beyond the law. The Cold War was the perfect cover for conspiracy. Every operation, every assassination abroad, every covert manipulation could be justified in the name of national security. If a president became a liability to that system, removing him would be seen not as treason, but as patriotism. And those involved would never have to fear exposure because the machinery of secrecy protected its own. Kennedy's speeches in 1963 began to sound more like warnings. He spoke about peace without fear, about ending the war mentality. He even said that the greatest threat to liberty came not from abroad, but from within, from secrecy and unchecked power. Those words struck nerves in places most Americans never knew existed. The president was calling out the system itself. And in that system, there were men who would not tolerate rebellion, especially from within their own ranks. What makes this even more chilling is how the narrative of the Cold War allowed almost any action to be justified. Governments lied. Agencies manipulated. Leaders were removed under the pretense of national interest. The public didn't question because they were too afraid of the communist threat. Fear was the currency of control, and Kennedy was trying to take that currency away. He wanted dialogue instead of division, cooperation instead of chaos. But in a world addicted to conflict, peace was the ultimate threat. The Cold War also created a psychological climate, paranoia, suspicion, and the constant need for enemies. It was an age where men in dark rooms believed they were saving the world by destroying anyone who stood in their way. In that environment, the assassination of a president could be carried out, covered up, and justified all at once. It wouldn't even require a massive conspiracy, just the quiet cooperation of people with overlapping motives and mutual silence. Kennedy had dared to step outside the script written for him. He wanted to talk to Khrushchev, to Castro, to make the world safer, not just stronger. But that wasn't the vision of those who controlled the gears of power. They believed America's strength came from fear of communism, fear of enemies, fear of change. Kennedy's optimism was dangerous because it challenged that foundation. So, when the motorcade rolled through Dallas on that bright November day, it wasn't just a president being targeted. It was a message being sent. A message from the shadow world of power politics, that no one, not even the leader of the free world, could stand in the way of the machine. When the shots rang out in Dealey Plaza, chaos erupted. But almost immediately, something even more calculated began, a race not to find the truth, but to control it. From the moment the motorcade came to a stop, a veil of secrecy began to descend over the investigation. Evidence vanished, witnesses were silenced, and the story the world would be told was already being written, not by those seeking justice, but by those protecting power. The first strange thing that happened after the assassination was the handling of the president's body. According to Texas law, an autopsy should have been conducted in Dallas, the site of the murder. But within minutes, federal agents forced their way into Parkland Hospital over the objections of local authorities and took the body away to Washington, D.C. Why the rush? Why break the law? It wasn't respect or protocol, it was control. Whoever controlled the autopsy controlled the narrative. At Bethesda Naval Hospital, the official autopsy was performed by military doctors, not forensic pathologists. They were under orders, surrounded by high-ranking officers and intelligence officials. Nurses and staff later described an atmosphere of fear and confusion. Key notes from the autopsy went missing. Photographs disappeared. Some of the X-rays were replaced. Even the chain of custody for the physical evidence, the brain, the bullet fragments, the clothing, became unclear. To this day, parts of that evidence have never resurfaced. Then there's the infamous magic bullet. The Warren Commission claimed that one bullet caused 7 wounds in 2 men, entering Kennedy's back, exiting through his throat, hitting Governor Connolly's back, shattering his wrist and lodging in his thigh. Yet the bullet itself was found in nearly pristine condition on a stretcher. The commission presented it as fact, but experts around the world have called it impossible. No bullet could perform such acrobatics, no matter how magic. It was a theory built not on science, but on necessity. Because without that single bullet, the lone gunman theory collapses. Witnesses in Dealey Plaza told a different story, one of multiple shooters, of gunfire coming from the grassy knoll, of smoke rising from behind the fence. But those accounts were dismissed or buried. Some witnesses claimed they were never contacted by investigators. Others reported being pressured to change their statements. A few even died under suspicious circumstances in the years that followed. The message was clear: don't talk, don't question, don't remember. And the footage, perhaps the most chilling piece of evidence, the Zapruder film. Abraham Zapruder, a local businessman, captured the assassination on his home movie camera. That film was immediately seized by Life magazine, owned at the time by Henry Luce, a close friend of the intelligence community. The film was hidden from the public for years. When portions were finally shown, they were edited and slowed, the most disturbing frames cropped or blurred. For over a decade, Americans never saw the unaltered version. Why hide it, unless it revealed something the official story couldn't explain? As time went on, more pieces of evidence seemed to disappear. The Dallas Police Department claimed that Oswald's notebook, in which he allegedly wrote about his political beliefs, was destroyed. The Secret Service shredded motorcade security plans. The FBI lost photos of bullet fragments from the autopsy. And in 1975, when the House Select Committee on Assassinations reopened the case, they discovered entire sections of the CIA's and FBI's JFK files were missing, either misplaced or deliberately withheld. When investigators asked for Oswald's intelligence records, The agency stalled, redacted, and eventually admitted that some of the files had been destroyed years earlier. Among those files were reports about Oswald's time in Mexico City, contacts with known intelligence assets, and a detailed list of people who visited him in the weeks before the assassination. Those names are still classified to this day. And then there's the curious case of the missing brain. Yes, the president's brain. It was removed during the autopsy for study, sealed as evidence, and placed in the National Archives. But when officials checked years later, it was gone. Vanished without a trace. No one could explain how one of the most critical pieces of evidence in a presidential murder investigation simply disappeared from government custody. In 1992, public pressure finally forced Congress to pass the JFK Records Act, demanding the release of all assassination-related documents. Yet even decades later, thousands of pages remain redacted or completely withheld. Each administration since has delayed their release, citing national security. But what kind of national security is threatened by the truth of a murder that happened over 60 years ago? What could possibly be so dangerous even now that it must remain locked away? Every time a new batch of documents is released, small cracks appear in the official story. Memos showing CIA awareness of Oswald months before the assassination. FBI reports admitting the agency failed to share information with the Secret Service. Notes suggesting that certain individuals connected to intelligence operations were in Dallas that day. Piece by piece, the puzzle grows more complex and the cover-up more obvious. It's almost as if the evidence was never meant to tell the truth, but to hide it. Every photograph withheld, every file destroyed, every witness ignored, all of it builds a pattern of control. From the autopsy room to the archives, from the Dallas police to Washington boardrooms, the truth was being managed. Not lost, managed. And behind that management was an invisible consensus that whatever really happened in Dallas could never be allowed to surface. Because if it did, it wouldn't just expose a conspiracy. It would expose an entire system built on secrecy, deception, and power. The assassination of a president was not just a crime. It was a message. And the missing evidence, the hidden files, the silenced witnesses, they're all part of the same message, written not in ink, but in absence. For decades, the truth about JFK's assassination lay buried beneath layers of secrecy. Hidden behind locked cabinets stamped "Top Secret." Generations were told to move on, to trust the official story. But time has a way of uncovering what power tries to bury. In recent years, new declassified files, thousands of pages once kept from public eyes, have begun to reveal fragments of a hidden picture. A picture that challenges everything we thought we knew about that dark November day. When the JFK Records Act was passed in 1992, it was supposed to bring closure. Congress promised that by 2017, all remaining files would be released to the public. But when that date finally came, something strange happened. Not all the files were released. Hundreds of pages were withheld. Entire sections were redacted, names blacked out, paragraphs erased. Even after 6 decades, the government claimed that some information was still too sensitive for the American people to see. Too sensitive about a murder that happened in 1963. That alone tells you the truth still frightens those who guard it. The documents that did make it into public hands, however, tell a different story from the one written by the Warren Commission. In them are hints, connections, and contradictions that draw a map straight into the heart of America's intelligence world. One of the most shocking revelations involves Lee Harvey Oswald's relationship with U.S. intelligence agencies. Several of the newly released files confirm that both the CIA and FBI had active interest in Oswald long before Kennedy's assassination. Internal memos reveal that Oswald's name appeared in surveillance reports, that his movements were tracked, and that some agents even met with individuals who claimed to know him. One 1963 document shows that the CIA's Mexico City station had recordings of a man identifying himself as Oswald speaking with Soviet and Cuban officials, yet the agency later admitted that the voice on those tapes did not match Oswald's. That revelation raises a chilling question. If the CIA knew the voice wasn't Oswald's, why didn't they correct the record? Why let the world believe the man accused of killing the president was tied to foreign enemies unless they wanted that narrative to stick? Another set of files exposes how intelligence officers within the CIA were running operations that mirrored the Oswald situation, using defectors, double agents, and false identities to manipulate foreign perception. The newly unsealed documents confirm that multiple CIA officers were stationed in Dallas at the time of the assassination, including some who were part of covert anti-Castro missions. These details were never disclosed to the Warren Commission. Not once. Declassified FBI files add yet another twist. They show that just weeks before the assassination, an FBI informant warned about a plot to kill the president. The report was marked urgent, but the follow-up vanished. The agent who filed it said he never received a response. It was as if the warning was swallowed by the very system meant to protect the president. Even more disturbing are the connections between higher-ranking intelligence officials and individuals later linked to Oswald's movements. A memo written by CIA officer David Phillips, who oversaw propaganda operations against Cuba, discusses managing assets in Mexico around the same time Oswald visited the embassies there. Phillips later denied ever meeting Oswald, but witnesses and other documents suggest otherwise. Some even claim that Oswald was being monitored as part of a psychological operation, a controlled setup designed to frame him as a communist sympathizer if the need ever arose. And then there are the records pointing to the CIA's deep involvement with anti-Castro exile groups in Miami and New Orleans, the very cities where Oswald was most active before the assassination. The files confirm that these groups were armed, trained, and funded by U.S. intelligence to overthrow Castro. Many of their members were angry with Kennedy for refusing to invade Cuba after the Bay of Pigs. Some of those men had military training, sniper skills, and access to networks capable of organizing an operation like the one that unfolded in Dallas. Yet none of this was presented to the Warren Commission. Not a word. Recently declassified materials also include transcripts from the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s, which concluded that there was a high probability of a conspiracy, but their final report was vague, limited, and heavily censored. What the new files reveal is that the committee had uncovered more than it was allowed to publish, including testimony about CIA obstruction, surveillance of witnesses, and deliberate misdirection. In one memo, a staff investigator wrote that the CIA had systematically withheld vital information, effectively sabotaging the investigation from within. Another shocking revelation involves President Lyndon B. Johnson himself. Several newly unsealed documents suggest that Johnson privately believed the assassination was not the work of one man. He reportedly told close associates that he suspected foreign involvement, yet he never said so publicly. Instead, he supported the Warren report, likely because admitting a conspiracy could have sparked national panic or even war. And the modern revelations don't stop with paper. Digital forensic analysis of the Zapruder film and Dallas police recordings have provided new insight into the number of shots fired, data suggesting that more than 3 shots may have echoed through Dealey Plaza that day. Independent researchers using modern audio and video enhancement techniques found anomalies that align with witness testimonies of gunfire from multiple directions, evidence that was ignored or dismissed decades ago. So, what do all these newly revealed files and findings tell us? They tell us that the story America was given, the lone gunman, the magic bullet, the quick investigation, was never the full story. They show patterns of concealment, of intelligence interference, and of careful narrative control that stretch from 1963 to the present day. Each declassified page is like a fingerprint left behind by history, pointing not to a single assassin, but to a network of influence determined to shape the truth itself. Even now, the National Archives continues to hold thousands of unreleased pages. Experts who have reviewed them believe they contain names, connections, and communications that could finally expose who orchestrated the assassination and why. But as long as those files remain sealed, the official truth remains incomplete. Every blacked out name, every missing memo, every withheld document, it all speaks louder than words. Because if the truth didn't threaten anyone, it would have been released long ago. For more than 60 years, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy has haunted the conscience of a nation. It began as a tragedy, a single gunshot that shattered America's innocence, but over time, it became something far more disturbing, a symbol of how truth can be buried beneath power, fear, and deception. We were told a simple story: one man, one rifle, one act of madness. But as we've seen, the deeper you look, the more that story begins to crumble. From the inconsistencies in the official report to the intelligence agency's secret operations, from Oswald's mysterious past to the suppressed files that refuse to see daylight. Each piece of evidence points towards something calculated, something orchestrated. The pattern is unmistakable. The witnesses who were silenced, the evidence that vanished, the files that remained classified for decades. This was never just about one man pulling a trigger. It was about the machinery behind him. Political, military, and covert forces with everything to gain and everything to lose. Even now, as newly declassified files trickle out year by year, we're left with fragments of the truth, hints of a larger conspiracy that continues to evade full exposure. What we do know is that the assassination didn't just end a presidency. It changed the course of history. It altered how Americans saw their leaders, their government, and the very idea of truth itself. JFK once said, "The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society." Yet his death became one of the most secretive events in modern history. A wound that refuses to close. And maybe that's why this story still grips us today, because it isn't only about the past. It's about the present. It's about how far those in power will go to protect their interests, and how long ordinary people will keep searching for the truth they were denied. So, as the files continue to surface and history slowly unravels, one question remains: will we ever know the full truth about who killed President John F. Kennedy? Or will the final pieces of the puzzle stay buried forever, locked away behind the very walls he once swore to tear down?